In the rugged heart of the Adirondacks, where the pines stand like ancient sentinels against the biting wind, silence isn't just a lack of noise, it's a presence. For Martha Sullivan, that silence had been her only constant companion for 2 long years. At 72, Martha was a woman carved from the same granite as the mountains she lived among. A retired head librarian from the local university, she had spent 4 decades organizing the world's knowledge into neat Dewey Decimal categories. She believed in facts, in cross-references, and in the quiet power of a well-placed footnote. Her husband, Julian, had been her opposite, an architect of light and glass, a man who built soaring structures that seemed to defy gravity. When he died of a sudden, catastrophic heart failure in his study, the light in the house seemed to dim permanently. He left behind a legacy of beautiful buildings, a grieving son, and a widow who still set out 2 coffee mugs every morning out of a habit that refused to die. Martha lived in the glass house, the final masterpiece Julian had designed for them. It was a marvel of cedar and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the obsidian waters of Lake Placid. But to Martha, it was a goldfish bowl. She felt exposed, a specimen of grief under the watchful eyes of the mountain. It was a Tuesday, the day the week usually started to feel heavy. The first frost of October had kissed the ferns, turning them a brittle, rusted brown. Martha was in the kitchen, her hands submerged in warm, lemony water when she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. She didn't need to look at the security monitor to know it was Skylar. Skylar, her daughter-in-law, was a woman who moved through the world with the precision of a surgical strike. At 34, she was a high-level medical risk management consultant, a title that Martha always felt sounded like a polite way of saying she made problems disappear. She was beautiful in a way that felt manufactured, teeth too white, hair too blonde, eyes too alert. She had married Martha's son, Caleb, 5 years ago, and while Martha had tried to be the welcoming matriarch, there was always a glass wall between them. "Martha, darling, you're still doing dishes by hand?" Skylar's voice preceded her as she swept into the kitchen, smelling of expensive sandalwood and cold mountain air. She dropped her designer handbag on the marble island and reached out to squeeze Martha's shoulder. It was a gesture of affection that felt like a blood pressure cuff, tight and clinical. "It keeps my hands busy, Skylar," Martha replied, drying her fingers on a linen towel. "And it gives me time to think. What brings you up the mountain on a Tuesday?" "I was just at the clinic in Saranac Lake and thought I'd check in. Caleb is worried, you know. He says you haven't been answering his texts." Martha sighed. Caleb, her sweet, impulsive Caleb. He was a brilliant engineer who couldn't manage a checkbook to save his life. Since Julian's death, Caleb had been drowning in debt from a series of failed green energy startups, and Martha knew his concern for her was often entangled with his concern for his own inheritance. "I told him I'm fine. I just forget to charge the phone," Martha lied. The truth was she enjoyed the silence. Skylar spent the next hour fluttering around the kitchen, talking about her latest contracts and the rising cost of living in the city. She seemed distracted, her eyes constantly flitting to her reflection in the dark windows. When her own phone rang, a sharp, aggressive digital chirp, she cursed under her breath. "I have to take this, Martha. It's the legal team from the hospital group. Do you mind if I step out onto the deck?" "Of course not." Martha watched Skylar step out, the wind whipping her silk scarf. As she did, she left her iPad Pro lying face up on the kitchen island. It was a sleek silver slab of technology, the screen still glowing. Martha went to move it to the side to avoid a stray water droplet, but as her hand reached out, the screen flickered with a new notification. It was an email. The sender's name was J.S. Memories, but it wasn't the name that stopped Martha's heart. It was the avatar. It was a photo of Julian. But it wasn't a photo Martha had ever seen. In it, Julian was wearing a purple linen shirt, a color he had always claimed he hated. He was laughing, a glass of dark wine in his hand, and behind him was the distinct, sun-drenched architecture of a Mediterranean villa. They had never been to Italy. Julian had always claimed he was too busy with the Adirondack Commission to travel abroad. The preview of the email read, "The account in the Caymans is ready for the final transfer. The architect's last gift is almost yours, my love. Tuesday, as planned." Martha felt a coldness spread from her chest to her fingertips, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She was a librarian. She knew how to look for patterns. She knew how to read between the lines. Tuesday, as planned. She looked out at the deck. Skylar was paced back and forth, her back to the window, her gestures animated and heated. Martha looked back at the iPad. With a trembling finger, she swiped. Skylar hadn't locked it. The medical risk manager was, ironically, careless with her own security. Martha opened the email thread. It went back months, years. The emails weren't from a ghost. They were from an encrypted server, using Julian's likeness as a cruel, private joke. They were filled with intimate details, references to our secret afternoons at a cabin Martha didn't recognize, talk of the old woman's predictable habits, and most chillingly, a timeline. Martha scrolled back, her eyes burning as she read. The affair between her husband and her daughter-in-law hadn't been a brief lapse in judgment. It had been a calculated 3-year-long betrayal. Julian had been funding Skylar's lifestyle, funneling money into offshore accounts Martha didn't know existed. But the most devastating blow came from an email dated just 1 week before Julian's heart attack. Julian to Skylar. Martha is starting to ask questions about the missing funds from the farm co-op account. She's too smart, Skylar. She's looking at the ledgers. We have to finish this. Skylar to Julian. Don't worry about the ledgers. I've adjusted your prescriptions. The fatigue you're feeling is just the beginning. Once you're gone, the glass house and the insurance will be our foundation. She'll never suspect a thing. She trusts me. Martha gripped the edge of the marble island so hard her knuckles turned white. The lemon scent of the dish soap suddenly felt nauseating. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her with a younger woman. He had been a co-conspirator in his own demise, or perhaps a victim who thought he was in control until the very end. She heard the slide of the deck door. In one swift, practiced motion, Martha swiped the screen off and pushed the iPad back to exactly where it had been. She turned to the stove, picking up a kettle. Everything okay? Skylar asked, stepping back inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Just making tea, Martha said, her voice sounding to her own ears like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. You look troubled, Skylar. Just work. You know how it is. People are so litigious these days, Skylar said, grabbing her iPad and sliding it into her bag. She didn't even check to see if it had been moved. To her, Martha was a relic, a quiet, harmless woman who spent her days reading dusty books and mourning a man she never truly knew. I should get going, Skylar said, checking her watch. Caleb and I are having dinner with some investors tonight. I'll call you tomorrow? Yes, Martha said, forced a smile that felt like a crack in parched earth. Tomorrow. As Skylar's car disappeared down the driveway, Martha didn't cry. The time for tears had passed 2 years ago. Instead, she went to Julian's old study. She sat in his leather chair, the one that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and cedar. She opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one with the false back she'd discovered while cleaning months ago, but had been too afraid to explore. She reached in and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was her own secret. Since the funeral, she had been keeping a log of the inconsistencies she'd found. The missing $50,000 from their joint savings, the strange consulting fees paid to a shell company in Delaware, the way Julian's heart medication seemed to run out 2 weeks early every month. She had been a librarian for 40 years. She knew that stories weren't just told in words, they were told in the gaps between them. She picked up her pen and wrote a new entry. October 6th. The ghost has a face. The face is Skylar's. But as she sat there, a new thought crept in. A poisonous, secondary realization. Caleb, her son. Caleb had been so insistent that Martha take it easy after the funeral. He had been the one to suggest that Skylar handle the complex medical paperwork and the insurance claims, saying it would be too much stress for Martha. Martha stood up and walked to the wall-to-ceiling windows. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the lake. She thought about Caleb's gambling debts. She thought about the $200,000 he had suddenly earned from a new investor just 3 months after Julian's death. She picked up her phone and dialed her son's number. Hey, Mom, Caleb answered on the second ring. He sounded rushed. The background noise of a busy city street hummed behind him. Everything okay? Skylar said she was heading up your way. She just left, Martha said, her voice steady. Caleb, I was looking through some of your father's old architectural sketches, the ones for the resort project in Lake George. I found some notes about a private investment you made with him back in 2023. A large sum. There was a silence on the other end, a silence that lasted a fraction of a second too long for a man with a clear conscience. Oh, that, Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. Yeah, Dad wanted to help me out with the startup. It was a private loan, Mom. We didn't want to worry you with the details while you were dealing with his health issues. Why? Is something wrong? No, Martha said, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the glass. I just wanted to make sure the records were straight for the tax preparer. I'll talk to you later, honey. She hung up. Twist 2 had landed with the weight of a mountain. Caleb knew. He hadn't just known about the money, he had known about the affair. He had sold his mother's dignity to pay off his debts, and he had used his wife's infidelity as a bargaining chip for his own survival. Martha felt a strange, cold clarity. She wasn't just a widow, she was a woman standing in the center of a web spun by the people she loved most. They thought she was a victim. They thought she was a person of interest in a story they were writing. They were wrong. Martha Sullivan was the librarian, and she was about to start a new chapter. She went to her computer and began to type. She didn't write a letter to the police. She didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. Instead, she logged into the university's digital archive, using her old administrator credentials. She began to cross-reference Schuyler's professional license with the death records of high-net-worth patients at the clinics she had consulted for over the last decade. If Schuyler was a risk manager, Martha wanted to see exactly what kind of risks she had been managing. As the moon rose over the Adirondacks, the glass house glowed like a lantern in the dark. Inside, Martha Sullivan sat at the screen, her face illuminated by the blue light, a hunter in a forest of data. The first twist had revealed the betrayal. The second had revealed the complicity. But Martha was looking for the third, the one that would provide the leverage she needed to burn their house of cards to the ground. She found it at 2 a.m. A Detective Miller from the New York State Police had opened a file 6 months ago. An anonymous tip had been called in regarding Julian Sullivan's death. The tip claimed that the widow, Martha Sullivan, had been seen arguing with her husband about a change in his will just hours before his heart attack. The tip hadn't come from a stranger. The digital footprint of the anonymous call led back to a burner phone purchased at a CVS in Manhattan, just 3 blocks from Schuyler and Caleb's apartment. They weren't just stealing her money and her husband's memory. They were setting her up for his murder. Martha leaned back in the chair, her heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the photo of Julian on her desk, the man she had loved for 45 years, the man who had apparently spent his final days plotting with her daughter-in-law to frame her. Well, Julian, Martha whispered into the empty room, you always said I had a talent for research. I suppose it's time I put it to good use. She closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. She took the 2 coffee mugs out of the cupboard. She put one back on the shelf. From now on, Martha Sullivan only needed 1 cup. She sat at the table and waited for the sun to rise. She had a plan to form. She had a son to save, or to sacrifice, depending on how deep his rot went. And she had a daughter-in-law to destroy. The glass house was no longer a goldfish bowl. It was a fortress, and the war had just begun. The morning mist clung to Lake Placid like a cold, wet shroud. Inside the glass house, the silence was no longer heavy with grief. It was sharp, like a razor's edge. Martha Sullivan sat at her mahogany dining table, a single cup of black coffee steaming before her. She didn't look like the victim. She looked like a woman who had just cataloged a long-lost, dangerous manuscript and was now deciding which chapters to burn. The realization from the night before that her own son and daughter-in-law were framing her for Julian's murder had crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. Martha was a librarian. She knew that every villain had a motive, every crime had a paper trail, and every lie had a shelf life. Her first task was to handle Detective Miller. At 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. It wasn't the aggressive buzz of Schuyler. It was a measured, professional chime. Martha opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s, wearing a charcoal blazer that couldn't quite hide the sharp, observant eyes of a seasoned hunter. Mrs. Sullivan? I'm Detective Miller, New York State Police. We spoke briefly on the phone yesterday. Please come in, Detective, Martha said, her voice the perfect blend of weary widow and polite hostess. I was just about to start a fire. The dampness gets into the bones at my age. Miller stepped into the expansive living room, her gaze sweeping across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beautiful home. Julian Sullivan was a genius. He was an architect, Martha corrected gently, leading her to the fireplace. Geniuses are often difficult to live with. Architects just build the walls that hide the difficulty. Please, sit. Miller took a seat, opening a leather-bound notepad. I won't take much of your time. As I mentioned, we received an anonymous tip regarding a dispute between you and your husband regarding his estate, specifically a change in his will 3 days before he passed. Martha didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the firelight dancing in her silver hair. Detective, in 45 years of marriage, Julian and I had many disputes. He wanted to build. I wanted to preserve. He lived in the future. I lived in the archives. As for the will, Julian was always tinkering with his legacy. He was an artist of his own image. The tip suggested you were angry, Miller said, her pen poised, that you felt he was draining the family assets to fund projects you didn't approve of. If I killed every man who made a bad investment, Detective, the Adirondacks would be a graveyard, Martha said with a faint, dry smile. I loved my husband, but I am not a fool. I knew he was impulsive. If someone called you to suggest I harmed him, I would ask you to look at who stands to gain from that phone call. Miller paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Meaning? Meaning that Julian's life insurance is substantial, and I am 72. If I am out of the picture, the estate flows downward. Quickly, Martha watched the gears turn in Miller's head. She wasn't giving the detective a confession, she was giving her a new lead. A professional like Miller would hate being a pawn in someone else's game. We'll be looking into everyone involved, Mrs. Sullivan, Miller said, standing up, including the source of the tip. I would appreciate that. And Detective? Martha walked her to the door. In my library, we have a saying, the most important information is often found in the margins. Check the margins of my son's bank accounts. You might find what you're looking for. After Miller's car pulled away, Martha felt a flicker of triumph. She had planted the seed of doubt. Now she needed to water it with a little chaos. She went back to her computer. It was time to deal with Skylar. Martha knew Skylar's greatest weakness, her arrogance. Skylar believed Martha was a tech-illiterate relic. It was a common mistake the young made, assuming that because someone didn't use social media, they didn't understand the digital world. But Martha had spent years digitizing university records. She knew her way around a back-end server better than Skylar knew her way around a Botox clinic. Martha began by sending a very specific email to Skylar's work address. She didn't use her own name. She used a spoofed address that looked like it came from the Granite State Insurance Group. Subject: Urgent. Audit of policy number 8821-JS, Julian Sullivan. Dear Mrs. Sullivan, during a routine compliance review, our forensic team noted an inconsistency in the digital signature timestamp on the beneficiary change form dated August 14th. We require a secondary verification of the attending physician's credentials. Please provide the internal risk assessment report for this file by EOD Thursday. Martha knew this would hit Skylar like a physical blow. Skylar had been the one to manage that paperwork. If the insurance company was auditing it, her entire house of cards was at risk. 10 minutes later, Martha's phone rang. It was Skylar. Martha, hi honey. I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling today? Skylar's voice was pitched a semitone higher than usual, the sound of a woman trying to keep her balance on a sinking ship. I'm a bit rattled, Skylar. A Detective Miller was just here, asking about the will. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. A detective? Why on earth would the police be involved now? It's been 2 years. Someone called them, Skylar. Someone told them I was angry about the money. I'm scared. Caleb isn't answering his phone again, and I don't know what to do. Don't worry, Martha. Don't tell them anything. I'll handle it. I'll come up tonight. We'll look through the files together. Just stay calm. Thank you, dear. You're always so helpful. Oh, and Skylar? I found a key in Julian's old tackle box. It has a tag that says the cabin. Do we have a cabin? I don't remember a cabin. The silence that followed was deafening. The cabin was where the affair had happened. It was where the T, Tom, and Skylar met. I think that was an old project of his, Martha. Nothing important. Don't go looking for it. It's probably just a storage shed. I'll be there by 8. Bye. Martha hung up. She had them. She had Skylar in a state of panic, and she had the detective looking at the money. But the most painful part was still to come. Caleb. She needed to know if her son was a murderer or just a coward. Martha drove down to the village. Her old Volvo hummed through the winding roads. She went to the local hardware store and bought a high-definition, motion-activated trail camera, the kind hunters use to track deer. Then she went to the pharmacy and picked up a refill of her own heart medication. On the way home, she stopped at the cemetery. Julian's grave was marked by a minimalist slab of black marble, elegant and cold. Martha stood over it, the wind tugging at her coat. "You were always so obsessed with your final statement, Julian," she whispered. "You wanted a masterpiece. Well, you got one. You turned our family into a tragedy, but you forgot one thing. I was always the one who edited your work, and I'm not finished with this one yet." She reached into her bag and pulled out the small leather notebook she'd found in his desk. She had spent the morning decoding the architectural sketches. Julian hadn't just been drawing buildings. He had been hiding numbers. The dimensions of the windows in his last project matched the routing numbers of the offshore accounts. The glass house itself was a map of his betrayals. But as she looked at the black marble, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief. 45 years. She had known the way he liked his eggs, the way he hummed when he was drawing, the way he smelled of cedar and ambition. How much of it had been real? Was the love a lie, or was the lie just something he told himself to survive the love? She shook the feeling off. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Back at the house, Martha began the renovations. She installed the trail camera in the hallway, hidden inside a hollowed-out vintage encyclopedia of American history. She set up her laptop in the kitchen, connected to the camera's feed. Then she prepared the bait. She took out a stack of old bank statements and spread them across the kitchen island. In the center, she placed a manila envelope labeled Lucien Project, Offshore Ledgers. Inside were nothing but blank sheets of paper, but the label was enough to trigger a predator. At 7:45 p.m., headlights swept across the living room walls. Martha sat in the darkened kitchen, her heart beating a slow, rhythmic thud. She took a sip of herbal tea and waited. Skylar didn't knock. She used her spare key. She entered the house with a hurried, frantic energy. Martha stayed in the shadows of the breakfast nook. "Martha? It's me," Skylar called out. Martha didn't answer. She watched through the cracked door as Skylar went straight to the kitchen island. She saw Skylar's eyes lock onto the manila envelope. The medical risk manager didn't hesitate. She grabbed the envelope, her hands shaking as she ripped it open. When she saw the blank pages, she let out a low, guttural hiss of frustration. "Where is it, you old bitch?" Skylar whispered to the empty room. The mask had slipped. The darling daughter-in-law was gone. In her place stood a woman whose soul was as cold as the lake outside. Skylar began to tear the kitchen apart, opening drawers, dumping out the contents of Martha's mail bin. She was looking for the evidence Martha had hinted at. She was looking for her own survival. Then the front door opened again. It was Caleb. "Skylar, what the hell are you doing?" Caleb stood in the doorway, looking at the mess. He looked exhausted, his suit jacket rumpled, his face pale. "She knows, Caleb. She's been looking at the ledgers. She found the key to the cabin." Skylar turned on him, her face contorted. "The insurance audit is happening. If she talks to that detective again, we're done. Do you understand? We go to prison, not just for the fraud, but for the medication adjustments." Caleb flinched as if she'd struck him. "You said it would look like a natural heart attack. You said the digoxin would be out of his system in hours." "It was. But she's a librarian, Caleb. Bà ta đang so chui mọi thư lại. Bà ta không lu lẫn như chúng ta nghĩ đâu." Martha, listening from the shadows, felt a tear escape and roll down her cheek. Digoxin. They had said it out loud. Her son hadn't just known. He had been an accomplice to his father's murder. "We have to stop her," Skylar said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, calm whisper. "She has heart palpitations, Caleb. She takes medication every night. If we just increase the dose tonight, a little bit more than usual, she'll pass away in her sleep, a tragic, grief-stricken widow joining her husband. No one will question it, not even Miller." "No, Skylar, I can't. She's my mother. She's a threat, Caleb. She's going to take everything. The house, the money, our future. Do you want to spend the rest of your life in a cage? Think about Ethan. Do you want him to grow up with a father in Sing Sing?" Martha watched her son. She watched him crumble. She watched the boy she had raised, the boy who used to bring her wildflowers, nod his head in a slow, agonizing surrender. "Fine," Caleb whispered, "but I won't be here to see it. Go to the car. I'll be out in 10 minutes. Skylar moved toward the medicine cabinet in the hallway. Martha knew what she was going to do. She was going to swap the pills, but Martha was already moving. She slipped out the back door into the freezing night, her coat pulled tight. She didn't head for the car. She headed for the barn. In the barn, Julian had kept an old, high-frequency radio system for communicating with the farmhands during the winter storms. Martha turned it on. It was connected to the house's intercom system, a feature Julian had installed so he could call her for coffee from his workshop. She picked up the microphone. "Skylar," Martha's voice boomed through the house, amplified by the intercom speakers. It sounded like the voice of a ghost, echoing off the glass walls. In the hallway, Skylar froze, the pill bottle in her hand. She looked around, her eyes wide with terror. "The glass house is a masterpiece, isn't it?" Martha's voice continued, calm and chilling. "Julian built it to be transparent. He wanted everyone to see the light, but he forgot that glass also reflects. It reflects the truth." "Martha, where are you?" Skylar shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm in the archives, Skylar. I'm looking at the death records. I'm looking at the risk management you did for the Henderson estate in 2018 and the Miller family in 2021. You have a pattern, dear. You find wealthy, lonely men and you make them disappear. But you made a mistake with the Sullivans. You forgot that I'm the one who keeps the records." Skylar ran for the front door, but Martha had already used the remote security app to lock it. The glass house was now a cage. "Caleb!" Skylar screamed, banging on the glass. But Caleb was sitting in the car, his head in his hands, unable to hear her over the wind. Martha stood in the barn, watching the house through the security monitor. She saw Detective Miller's car turn into the driveway, its blue and red lights off, but its presence undeniable. Martha had called her 20 minutes ago, telling her she had evidence of a break-in. "It's over, Skylar," Martha said into the microphone. "The detective is here, and I've recorded everything you just said to Caleb, the digoxin, the plan for tonight. It's all on the server." Skylar slumped against the glass, the pill bottle slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the floor. Martha watched as the police officers swarmed the house. She watched as they pulled Caleb from the car and led Skylar out in handcuffs. The silence returned to the Adirondacks, but this time, it wasn't a shroud. It was a clean slate. Martha Sullivan stepped out of the barn and into the cold night air. She looked up at the moon, clear and bright over the peaks. She was a widow. She was a mother who had lost her son to greed. She was a woman who had seen the worst of humanity in her own living room. But as she walked back toward the glass house, her silhouette sharp against the snow, she felt a strange, quiet power. She had survived. She went inside, past the police tape, past the shattered remains of her family. She went to the kitchen and picked up her single coffee mug. She poured a fresh cup, sat at the table, and opened a book. "Chapter 3, Martha whispered to the empty, transparent house. "The rebuilding." The glass house had never felt so fragile. In the days following the arrests, the Adirondack winter moved in with a vengeance, burying the driveway in 3 feet of unforgiving snow. Martha Sullivan sat in the great room, watching the flakes collide with the floor-to-ceiling windows. The police tape was gone. The risk managers were in orange jumpsuits in a county lockup, and the silence that remained was no longer a haunting. It was an exorcism. But for Martha, the story wasn't over. A librarian knows that a book isn't finished until the last footnote is verified. Detective Miller had been thorough. The recording Martha made from the barn, combined with the trail camera footage and the digital breadcrumbs of the offshore accounts, was a prosecutor's dream. Caleb, broken and weeping, had signed a full confession within 6 hours of his arrest, naming Skylar as the mastermind behind the medication adjustments. Skylar, true to her nature, had said nothing, her eyes as cold and calculating as the day she arrived. Yet a question lingered in the back of Martha's mind like a persistent itch. Julian. Why had he gone along with it? Why had a man who prided himself on his legacy allow a woman like Skylar to dismantle his life? Was he a victim, or was he a willing participant in a grand, tragic design? The answer arrived on a Friday, delivered by a courier who had to use snowshoes to reach the front door. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope from a law firm in Burlington, Vermont. One Martha didn't recognize. Scheduled delivery, October 16th, 10 days after the anniversary of his death. Inside was a thumb drive and a single sheet of vellum. "Martha," the note read in Julian's hurried architectural script. "The foundation was cracked. I had to build a new one. Watch the file. The truth is in the glass." Martha went to her study and plugged the drive into her laptop. A video file appeared. She clicked play. The screen filled with Julian's face. He looked gaunt, the shadows under his eyes deeper than Martha remembered from those final weeks. He was sitting in this very study, the same mountains visible behind him. "Martha," he began, his voice raspy. "If you're watching this, then Skylar has played her hand, and you, my brilliant, resilient Martha, have countered it. I know you found the offshore accounts. I know you found the T messages. I wanted you to find them." Martha gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "I was a fool, Martha," Julian continued, looking away from the camera. "I let vanity cloud my judgment. Skylar, she was a mirror. She reflected back a version of me that was young, powerful, and adored. By the time I realized she was a predator, it was too late. She had Caleb. She had my son's debts, his secrets, his soul." He leaned closer to the camera, his expression urgent. "She started the adjustments in August. I felt my heart failing, felt the rhythm breaking. I'm an architect, Martha. I know when a structure is being sabotaged from within. I could have stopped her. I could have gone to the police. But I knew Skylar. She would have slipped away. She would have destroyed Caleb to save herself. I had to ensure she was caught in a trap so tight, even her brilliance couldn't find a gap." Julian took a shaky breath. "I channeled the money to the Caymans to give her a motive, a trail that led directly to her. I changed the will to provoke her, and I left the clues in the glass house for the only person in the world smart enough to find them. You. I sacrificed my remaining months to ensure you had the evidence to take her down. It was my final statement, Martha. A masterpiece of justice, even if the architect had to die to complete it." The video flickered and ended. Martha sat in the darkness, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in her eyes. The third twist had landed. Julian hadn't just been a victim. He had turned his own murder into a sting operation. He had used his death to save his son and protect his wife. It was the most arrogant, brilliant, and heartbreaking thing he had ever done. But there was one more chapter. Twist 4, The Lawyer and the Predator. A week later, Martha attended the preliminary hearing in the county courthouse. She sat in the front row, her silver hair pulled back, her spine a column of steel. Skylar appeared in the courtroom, flanked by a high-priced lawyer from New York City, a man named Thomas Vane. As Martha watched them whisper, she noticed a subtle shift in their body language. A touch on the arm, a lingering look. Martha opened her leather notebook. She had spent the last 48 hours doing what she did best: research. Thomas Vane wasn't just a lawyer. He was the T from the encrypted emails. The photo Martha had seen on the iPad, the laughing Julian in the purple shirt, wasn't Julian. It was an AI-generated deepfake created by Vane to keep Skylar focused on the ghost of the money while they planned their escape together. Skylar wasn't just a predator. She was being played by a bigger shark. Martha stood up during a recess and approached the defense table. The bailiffs shifted, but Martha's calm demeanor disarmed them. "Skylar," Martha said, her voice quiet but carrying like a bell in the silent room. Skylar looked up, a sneer forming on her lips. "Come to gloat, Martha. Enjoy the house while you can. My legal team will have this thrown out by Christmas." Martha looked at Thomas Vane, then back to Skylar. "I'm a librarian, dear. I believe in the integrity of the record. And the record shows that Mr. Vane here opened a joint account in the British Virgin Islands 3 months ago, an account that requires his signature alone for any withdrawals over $10,000. Vane's face went white. Skylar froze. "What are you talking about?" "He's been managing your risks, Skylar," Martha continued, her eyes locked on her daughter-in-law. "Just like you managed Julian's. He's already prepared the paperwork to testify against you in exchange for immunity regarding the fraud charges. He has the deepfake software on his laptop at the Waldorf. He's the one who gave the police the tip about me, to keep the focus off the two of you until the money cleared." The explosion was instantaneous. Skylar didn't scream. She lunged. She turned on Vane with a primal, jagged fury, her fingernails clawing at his face before the bailiffs could tackle her. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Martha stood still in the center of the storm. Twist 5, The Predator's Betrayal. She watched as Skylar was dragged away, screaming obscenities at the man who had been her partner in crime. She watched as Vane was led away for questioning, his immunity dissolving in the face of Martha's new evidence. As Martha walked out of the courthouse, Detective Miller caught up to her on the steps. "Mrs. Sullivan," Miller said, shaking her head, I've been on the force for 25 years. I've never seen a civilian dismantle a defense like that. How did you know about the Virgin Islands account? I didn't, Martha said, adjusting her scarf against the wind. I guessed. A man like that always has a back door. I just had to wait for him to think I'd found it. He did the rest with his reaction. Miller stared at her, a look of profound respect in her eyes. You're a dangerous woman, Martha. No, Detective. I'm just a woman who has spent 72 years reading the fine print. People always forget the fine print. The rebuilding. Spring came late to the Adirondacks. The ice on Lake Placid groaned and cracked, giving way to the dark, clear water beneath. Martha stayed in the glass house. She didn't sell it. She didn't hide from the memories. Instead, she opened the windows. She let the scent of pine and damp earth wash away the lingering smell of sandalwood and medicine. Caleb was serving a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. Martha visited him every Sunday. They didn't talk about the money or the affair. They talked about the garden. They talked about the future. He was learning to be an engineer again, starting from the foundation up. He was her son, and while the rot had been deep, Martha believed in the power of restoration. One afternoon, Martha was in the kitchen, making a pot of tea. The sun was hitting the glass walls, creating a kaleidoscope of light on the hardwood floors. She picked up the 2 coffee mugs from the cupboard. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she walked out to the deck and placed one of the mugs on the cedar railing. To the masterpiece, Julian, she whispered. But the next one? The next one is mine. She went back inside and sat at the dining table. She didn't open a bank ledger or a legal file. Instead, she opened a fresh, leather-bound notebook. On the first page, she didn't write about the past. She didn't write about betrayal. She wrote a list of the things she wanted to learn. Piano, Italian, the real kind, landscape photography. Martha Sullivan was 72 years old. She had survived a husband's infidelity, a son's betrayal, and a murder plot that should have ended her life. She had outplayed the predators and reclaimed her throne. She took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her. Outside, a hawk soared over the lake, its wings catching the light. The glass house was no longer a goldfish bowl or a cage. It was a lighthouse, and Martha Sullivan was the one keeping the flame. She picked up her pen and began to write the first chapter of her new life. It wasn't a thriller. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a story about a woman who had found the most valuable thing in any library, herself.